Hey, this is the second part of a two-part series. You should probably go watch what is the objective best Weezer album first, or else you'll miss a bit of context. You can also stick around if you want, I'm not your dad, but if you ever feel confused as to how I found the ratings for these albums and where the word objective comes from, definitely give that video a watch and come back. Also, watch it anyway, it's a good video. Anyway, now we pick things up at the bottom half of our 15 album ranking. Number 8. Van Weezer, 65.5 out of 100 from critics, 58.7 from listeners, and 57.5 from fans. The mathematically most mid Weezer album. Coming out shortly after OK Human and described by Rivers Cuomo as super rock, you could never guess the same band made both of these, much less back to back. OK Human was something of a sequel to Pinkerton, mixed with heavy inspiration from current events. Van Weezer was released 4 months after, and it's metal? I'm not really a metalhead, and I know that group of people are very picky about everything, so let's just put a question mark there. Metal or not, it's different. It's loud and proud and unapologetic, and the guitar riffs are more important than the lyrics. But for as different as it is, it's a shining example of a piece of criticism that, I'm not kidding, every single album in the bottom half of Weezer's discography has received. Overproduction. If you've spent any time around a music nerd, you've probably heard the phrase, and Weezer fans and critics alike use the word to describe really any album they don't like. Wikipedia has a pretty apt description of the concept in case you're not totally familiar. Overproduction is the excessive use of audio effects, layering, or digital manipulation in music production. It's an antonym for authentic. If the album has instruments that sound as manufactured as the lyrics, it's overproduced. With all that in mind, Van Weezer actually did shockingly well in sales. I guess Weezer trying metal is more acceptable than Weezer trying pop, but this next album isn't so cut and dry. Number 9. The Red Album. 62 from critics, 58.7 from listeners, and 58.5 from fans. Red is strange. Released in 2008, it falls between two of Weezer's most famously hated albums, Make Believe in 2005 and Raditude in 2009. Yet unlike those two, which were very explicitly despised by critics and fans alike at the time of release, Red's reception was far less cut and dry. Even today, 14 years after its release, the jury is still out on its legacy. Some people adamantly call it a hidden gem, others passively call it a midlife crisis, but for the most part, nobody calls it anything. It may not be as viciously overlooked as an upcoming placement, but it's honestly just as forgotten. Remembered almost exclusively for the Pork and Beans music video and Rivers in a cowboy hat. The one thing I can say conclusively about Red is that I can't say anything conclusively about Red. Number 10. Hurley. 66 from critics, 60.5 from listeners, and 49.6 from fans. Sheesh. Hurley is another strange album, for entirely different reasons. I don't think anyone puts this album in their bottom 5, except for El Babe on Metacritic, and such a small minority put it in their top 5 that it's the only thing they talk about. If you think Maladroit is underrated, odds are you've never heard of Hurley. Honestly, odds are you've never heard of Hurley regardless. It's famously forgotten, a goddamn paradox. Maybe it wasn't different enough from the highly unpopular Raditude. Maybe the lyrics were too shallow. Maybe it was overproduced. Maybe it was bland. Maybe it was good. Just not good enough to escape the black hole that was Weezer's reputation in 2010. I can't say really, but for whatever reason, nobody paid any mind to Hurley. Hell, even Weezer's top historian Carl Koch just wasn't around to document its production like he did other albums, only being able to tell a Weezerpedia interview that it was scrapped and completely remade just 2 weeks before release. Hurley came out, got adequate reviews, then the whole world forgot it existed. I cannot think of a more deserving placement on this list. Alright, here comes the bottom 5. Please understand that all the following opinions are objective. If I sound like I'm being too harsh, I'm not. I'm simply trying to rationalize a ranking that is completely out of my control. If you disagree, please save those opinions for the comments section of this video. And remember, these aren't my rankings, they are that of the math gods. Number 11. Pacific Daydream. 60.5 from critics, 45.5 from listeners, and 43 from fans. This album was a follow-up to two very important Weezer albums. One served as a critical comeback, hooking in fans of classic Weezer that were turned off by what the band was producing in the 2000s. The other served as a commercial comeback, which, while fulfilling that purpose, still featured longtime fan of the band Jake Sinclair as producer, who helped the album appeal to Weezer fans. Both would receive the title of Weezer's comeback, yet both were compromises. Both were Rivers Cuomo saying, hey, these are for you. But he was very open about his next project being for him. An album entirely in his image. and Cuomo's image was mainstream. Rivers had developed a strange obsession with being popular around this time. He wanted to be in the top 40. He expressed that much privately to Dave Grohl in 2018, who shared the details a few years later to the Rolling Stone. It's no secret that every once in a while Rivers will want to escape his nerdy alt-rock bubble, and so we get Pacific Daydream. It was poppy and modern and overwhelmingly synthetic, and it shared a producer with Raditude. At a time when expectations were higher than ever, Weezer released the album no one was asking for. As expected, fans at the time despised Pacific Daydream. Critics, however, found it mostly mediocre, and oddly enough, that seems to be the sentiment that stuck. Though there remain a vocal few who love the album, and a roughly equal amount that hate the album who still argue to this day, I'd say Pacific Daydream is mostly remembered for being subpar, mainly being dragged down in the rankings by hatred found upon its initial release. Number 12, Make Believe. 50 from critics, 47.2 from listeners, and 42.1 from fans. If you haven't watched my video on Make Believe, here's a summary. Rivers Cuomo was depressed after the release of the band's fourth studio album, Maladroit. He wrote a couple songs during this period and recorded a few demos. Much like with Pinkerton, him being at a low point in his life seemed to be inspiring a deeply personal and depressing album. Then, he took a little break, changed up his lifestyle, went back to college, got a little religious, and found joy in his life. Halfway through production. Of course, it's a good thing that Cuomo was finally happy again, but for the sake of the album, half of your demos being recorded when you hate your life, while the others are recorded when you're feeling better than ever, really creates some confusion. This led to an album that starts with Beverly Hills and ends with Haunt You Every Day, a track written for Shrek 2 being back-to-back with a track written about feeling guilty for your mourning ex-girlfriend. In order to make such differing tracks sound cohesive in one album, the sad songs were mixed and re-recorded to sound more upbeat and fun. Make Believe gets the word overproduced thrown at it more than any other album for a reason, folks. Demos exist of this album that sound like they're off of Pinkerton, but they were forcibly made to fit next to goddamn Beverly Hills. This, stunningly, did not blow over well, leading to Weezer's first big critical failure. Every album before this had its haters, but this album was hated. Today, that hate remains mostly stagnant. It seems that newer fans of Weezer are appreciating the album more and more as time goes on, perhaps in comparison to some upcoming albums. Number 13, The Black Album. 53 from critics, 46.7 from listeners, and 39.5 from fans. Yikes. Let's put you in the shoes of Rivers Cuomo for a sec. Fans and critics did not like your last album one bit. No, not that one. Yeah, that one. Too synthetic, they shouted. You need to decide how to make sure history doesn't repeat itself with your next album. Do you A, return to your roots and try to channel classic Weezer again? B, try out a different flavor of rock music that your average fan probably also likes? C, do that introspective piano album that your buddy Jake suggested a few years back? Or D, more synthetic? You know which one he picked, and you know exactly how audiences felt about it. People hear Weezer's Black Album and think, oh, this one's gonna be dark. Here comes more Pinkerton and Maladroit, only to be met with Pacific Daydream, with less rock and more curse words. Though, the thing is, at this point, Weezer had made enough pop albums to where the Black Album didn't really shock some people. By 2019, many fans understood that not every album has to be Pinkerton. Sometimes, you can just have fun. Many fans understood this. Not most! Number 14. Coming as an absolute shock. The album I doubt you thought was even gonna make it onto the list. An album I'm sure you couldn't predict would be the second most hated Weezer album even in an alternate timeline. Allow me to reintroduce you to the Teal album. 56 from critics, 47.1 from listeners, and a breathtaking 33.8 from fans. Critics and listeners really didn't have all that much negativity to say about this one. Sure, it was always in the bottom 5, but never at number 14. It's the fan scores that really hurt Teal, which makes sense if you think about it. The average listener really has no stakes in Teal. It's just a cover album to them, no different than that by any other band. But to a Weezer fan, this album was a massive letdown. Nothing about Teal is truly Weezer, except for the strong sense that they're trying too hard to be popular. The songs on the album range from bland copies of the original to complete overproduced nightmares depending on who you ask. Honestly, I'm not really a connoisseur of cover albums, so I couldn't really tell you if Teal's especially bland or bad, but clearly it rubbed loads of people the wrong way. To quote Glide magazine, "The lifelessness of the covers ensures that it has a shelf life that isn't much longer than your average meme." Well, here we are. Honestly, as a YouTuber, I wish any other album got this score. That way I could end the video with a big surprise. But this video is objective. I used data from hundreds of reviews from all across the internet, and the consensus was almost unanimous. Number 15. Raditude. Big shock for those of you living under a rock. Raditude got a 53 from critics, a 40.6 from listeners, and a 29.7 from fans. It was the second lowest ranked album in terms of critic scores and by far the lowest in listener and fan scores. If you loved Weezer in 2009, you felt betrayed listening to Raditude. If you hated Weezer, you felt justified. If that was the first time you ever listened to Weezer, you would not be listening again. It's an album that's easy to hate because there's something in it for everyone to dislike. Don't like mindless love songs? Here's I Want You To. Don't like hip-hop? Here's Can't Stop Partying. Don't like this? Here's Love Is the Answer. Any track that isn't overtly hated is mostly forgotten. There remain many people who like the album, especially in recent years. To those of you watching this, I'm sorry. As a fellow Weezer fan, I know what it's like to have something you enjoy torn to shreds. And I'm a firm believer that if you like something that most people don't, that's a good thing. That means more positivity in the world. But this was an album that was never, ever going to escape the bottom 5. The Blue Album defined, for many people, what a good Weezer album was. Raditude defined what a bad Weezer album was. Albums before it were looked back at more fondly, and unpopular albums afterwards were given more slack just because they weren't Raditude. I can already hear the clattering keyboards of people spouting the predictability of this placement. But there's a good reason why this was so predictable, because finding a genuine fan of Raditude is like finding a polar bear in a snowstorm. For that reason, and many, many more, this is the objective worst Weezer album. And now, nobody ever has to argue about Weezer ever again. Like that's ever gonna happen. What a load of...
I can't stop partying, partying. I can't stop partying, partying. I gotta have Patron, I gotta have the beats, I gotta have a lot of pretty girls around me. Oh, I can't stop.